He warned of the consequences of complacency, Barack Obama looking east in a speech a short while ago in Brussels.
Russia's leadership is challenging truths that only a few weeks ago seemed self-evident.
In what was long planned as the U.S. president's only major speech of a European tour after a summit with EU leaders and a meeting with NATO, the U.S. president pledging to do its bit within the Atlantic Alliance. But even though Cold War allies have banded together, agreeing on phase one of sanctions with military exercises in the Baltics, Obama knows that back home there's little appetite to go further. A fresh sign of a U.S. in decline? Nonsense. Them are crocodile tears, warn many Europeans who argue that when markets punish Russia, and they have, a lot of it is with U.S.-based money. American clout obvious to European free trade deal negotiators who warn of a mismatch. We'll see why and ask if the U.S. is weaker or stronger than when the candidate Obama back in 2008 visited Berlin. Today, in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Obama's Europe pivot. And with us from Washington, Bruce Stokes. He's the Director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Center. Welcome back to the show, sir. He was Mikhail Gorbatchev's spokesman. Andrei GRATCHEV writes for Novaya Gazeta. Thank you for being with us.
Correct.
Former State Department official Laurie DUNDON. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Nice to see as well Raquel GARRIDO of the Party of the Left, the Parti de Gauche.
Hi.
And from the Real Economy, German-born boss of co-founder, of Paris-based internet big data solutions company TinyClues, Jakob HAESLER. Welcome back, sir. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. Our hashtag F24debate. Before the speech happened, and I'll start with you, Bruce Stokes, a former aide to Obama, quoted in the Financial Times, warned there'd be no Brandenburg Gate moment, a nod to that 2008 speech in Berlin. Today in Brussels, it was really all about Russia.
Yes, it was. And that's because obviously this is what's on everyone's mind, and it has focused our attention in the transatlantic relationship. It's a real test of the transatlantic relationship, but it's also a real challenge in the sense that neither Europeans nor Americans want military action in response to the invasion of Crimea. By the same token, the governments, at least in the United States and at least some of the European countries, want to make sure that the Russians do not press their advantage in the eastern Ukraine. The problem is that what we know from public opinion data in both Europe and the United States is the appetite for military action against Russia is very, very small. 6% of Americans want to take military action against Russia. You can barely find that kind of sentiment.
Let's talk about those numbers a minute. Bruce, your survey says overall 43% say Barack Obama's handling the situation about right. 35 say he's not being tough enough, and just 5% say he's being too tough. But let me ask you, are his approval ratings going up or down since the start of this crisis?
Well, his approval ratings have been bouncing around in the low 40s for some time now. Certainly a dramatic decline from when he began. They're higher than George W. Bush's were at this time in his second term. They're significantly lower than Bill Clinton's or Ronald Reagan's at this time.
Of course, we all know that over in Moscow, Andrei Gorbatchev, Vladimir Putin is at a 5-year high when it comes to popularity.
Yeah, exactly. And that worries me.
And did the speech today, do you think it'll have any impact? Several times during that speech, Barack Obama saying this is not about, now let me find the quote exactly here among all my notes. He said, this is not about punishing Russia.
Well, I hope that all of us, including our leaders, are becoming wiser with the lessons of history. So hopefully we are not back to the years of the Cold War, and it's not the new edition of it.
What impact, if any, does a speech like this one have on the Kremlin?
Well, I think that it will be judged. Certainly, I'm not a spokesman, as you can imagine, of the present president of this country. I think it's going to be judged along the following line. Is Mr. Obama choosing to join the camp of the hawks, many of whom might be and should be happy with what's going on, because with the Russian action in Crimea and the threat that represent the Russian troops on the Ukrainian border, well, you may feel that, it's a happy occasion for NATO to rediscover its legitimacy after a very questioned and uncertain period, for NATO planes to start flying along the borders of Russia, and then for NATO to become kind of synonymous to the European Union, at least seen from Russia. And curiously enough, that would satisfy the Russian hawks.
Why?
Because certainly that would play in the hands of those who would like Russia to leave or to return back to the situation of their siege fortress, surrounded by the enemy powers and threatened by the West, except that this time the legitimacy for these hawks back in Russia is no more the communist ideology. But maybe it can be even more dangerous, because the legitimacy could come from the conservative forces, nationalist forces, anti-Western forces, and church, which is traditionally in Russian history a conservative, anti-Western, anti-Catholic, and in the present circumstances very much, I would say, ally to the conservative forces, fundamentalist forces across the world.
In his speech today, Barack Obama saying this is not another Cold War. When you hear what Andrei GRATCHEV just said, do you wonder?
I think the U.S. is actually, I think Obama and the White House are very much concerned that things could continue to escalate, and they're doing everything they can to try to provide rhetoric of de-escalation, to try and affirm that they don't want to send this message of encircling or confronting Russia, but at the same time standing up for values by saying Russia is acting more like an adversary than a partner. We hope we can find a way forward. We keep the door open for a way
Obama talked about
forward.
air patrols in the Baltics, stepped up troop movements in Poland.
But this is where I found the speech and the actions of the last days, as you talked about with the new commitments, new NATO action. I found that to be a representation of how he does want to stand up for a firm line for NATO allies. And I don't think in a way that he has much choice other than to do that. What was interesting to me about the speech tonight is he went much further than he has, I think, in other cases on standing up for and articulating principles of democracy, supporting principles of individual rights, of rule of law, individual freedoms. And that, ironically, is something he's been criticized at home for. Politically, at home, he usually gets a bit of a hard beating for not standing up vocally enough on those issues. So what was interesting to me is he was taking the stand on principles. At the same time, I think they're trying to avoid steps towards military escalation as much as possible and keep a door open for diplomatic de-escalation.
Not everyone a fan of that speech. Francis on Facebook saying Obama's a double standard man. He supports other countries to overthrow legitimately elected leaders when it suits him. Obama, who said who dismissed that notion, although he did reiterate that he was against the invasion of Iraq. Jakob HAESLER, you grew up in Germany. You remember the 1980s, the Trident missiles, the buildup just before the disintegration of the Soviet Union. How do you think Germans will react to that speech today?
I think, in general, Germans have been acting cautiously, and German leaders have. And I think it is because of the weight of history, but it's also, and it's not just because of economic interest. I think the Germans have realized something, maybe a little earlier than others, is that the EU policy towards Ukraine that was pushing them towards you have to choose, you're either with us or you're against us, was a complete disaster. And the problem is we're waking up now and realizing that this whole interaction with putting pressure and saying you want this and putting this as if it were either or decision was an error. And so now how do you backtrack from that, recognizing legitimate Russian-Ukrainian ties, at the same time not giving up the idea that, of course, a large part of Ukraine has historically always been West-oriented when it was under Polish and whatever else other countries' domination. I mean, this country has been free country for 23 years, and the last time it was in 1917 for a very short period of time, and before that it was occupied all the time. So that multiplicity and the fact that the only solution can lie in the fact that the country within has to be made work together, that's, I think, what the Germans are getting and hopefully bringing to their partners.
All right, another reaction. I'm sure that the EU's pretty nervous, like in the good old days. I think that's a little ironic on the part of Artie there, like in the good old days of the Soviet Union. Are you nervous, Raquel Garrido?
I'm not nervous, but I do sense that there's something dangerous when Barack Obama comes to Europe and makes a speech as a leader of NATO. You notice the flags behind him were not the flags of the European Union, for instance. They were the flags of NATO members. So his speech he's a war leader, because NATO is first and above all a military alliance. And you were speaking about NATO's legitimacy, and I think evidently what is questionable and what is always to be questioned is NATO's legitimacy. I mean, what is the alliance of everyone against no one? And where does that go? What's the use of that? It's dangerous. And NATO's neighboring policy, its expansion policy towards the countries that circle Russia, Georgia, for instance, what happened in Georgia, or Ukraine, is by nature dangerous. So I think for Europeans, and especially for France, what we need to be affirming is that we don't want that sort of division, of world division. NATO shouldn't exist anymore. It has no use and no legitimacy. And certainly Ukraine has to be neutralized in terms of international relations. We cannot, as Europeans, consistently, permanently claim that Ukraine has to be closer to Europe or integrate the European Union, which is a crazy idea, or get closer to NATO, which is absurd and creates tensions. I mean, the United States never accepted when the Russians came to Cuba, because it's an obvious situation that cannot be tolerated by the United States. It's the same thing with the change of government in Ukraine. That the former oligarchy was getting rich because of the gas differential in prices. You know, the Russians were selling gas. So now you have a new oligarchy, an adventurous one, and there's a provocation that created the situation in Crimea today. But I mean, who has the means of military intervention against Russia? No one, especially not the Europeans, and especially not the Germans, whose gas comes directly through the pipeline that comes from Ukraine. So the minute you intervene militarily in Ukraine, or even you envisage sanctions, economic sanctions, the first ones to pay will be the German clients of the gas flow.
You wanted to go ahead?
Go ahead.
No, just a couple of points. I mean, today's speech was actually specifically not at NATO headquarters and not with the NATO flag behind it. And I think part of that is sensitivity to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people's distinction between the debate about whether they engage with the European Union, and that already being controversial enough, or engaging with NATO. And the Ukrainian leaders in the last days, as they have throughout the last few years, but specifically in the last days, have reaffirmed they're not seeking NATO membership. They're not seeking a NATO path forward for them. That military step is a whole nother step beyond integrating with the EU, and the US and European countries are also being careful to draw a fine distinction between military action and economic or political action. So it's a big leap to step between one to the other, and I just would be careful in lumping them all together.
Maybe I heard wrong, but I heard sentences about protecting our allies, and who are the allies? The strict members, current members, or are Ukrainians the allies, or Georgians the allies? And I mean, there are documents, NATO documents, that say that Georgia has to integrate NATO. That's an objective. It's a purpose.
And yet they're
so
not
it's
there
dangerous.
Yet, but
it's dangerous.
Some specific definitions. But at the same time, he also said in the speech, we are not sending troops in. We do not want military intervention.
Bruce Stokes, how do you think he broached it on that score? And what is the street cred of NATO where you are?
Well, certainly until these recent developments, there were some questions in the United States about the purpose of NATO, about its future. I think that Putin's action has encouraged people in this town that NATO does have a future. It's probably had a negative consequence from Russia's point of view as a result of that. I do think that there are two issues here that one of our other speakers raised that I find somewhat ironic. There are members of the NATO alliance, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Poles, who are very worried about this. And we do have treaty obligations to defend them. And we should, in fact, take their concerns seriously. That's the first point. The second point is that the people of the Ukraine should decide their own future. And if the people of the Ukraine decide they want to join the European Union, if we believe in democracy, then that path should be open to them. I understand the need for the reality of realpolitik and spheres of influence, but if we stand for the principle of self-determination, then the Ukrainian people should be able to make their own choices. That said and done, the biggest challenge going forward is, can the Ukrainian people get their act together? If we have an election at the end of May, and we again have a dysfunctional government, we'd have a corrupt government, we have a government that can't make decisions, make reforms, it would be, I think, a large ask for Europe and the United States to stand with Ukraine if they cannot, in fact, begin to reform their own society.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.